very much for joining us for today's webinar on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I am a Senior Associate with Scott Legal PC here in New York City. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. The TN visa really is one of the first options we consider when someone comes to us who's a national of Mexico or Canada and has a job offer in the U.S. and wants to come to the U.S. to work. It is a really streamlined option. It's quite fast, relatively inexpensive, so really is a wonderful option for someone wanting to come to the U.S. to work. And in this presentation, we'll talk to you a little bit about why that is. Before we get started, I did want to touch on a few things. The first is that although our firm does focus on business immigration, we handle the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law. So if you're looking for assistance with a family-based green card, an employment-based green card, a temporary visa like a visitor visa or a student visa, or even litigation, suing the government on a denial or suing the government on a delayed case, we handle all of that and would be very happy to help you. After this presentation, we will be sending you an email where you can reach out and schedule a consultation to talk about the specific circumstances you're dealing with. One of the things that I think does set our firm apart is that our founder, Ian Scott, has personally navigated the process, including a TN visa, but also a student visa, H-1B, and an E-2 visa. The firm was actually started on an E-2 visa, so his experience navigating the process really does inform the way that we work with our clients. That email that I mentioned before is also going to include a link where you can sign up for our future webinars. We try to do at least 2 webinars a week, and these do span, again, the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law. We hope you'll sign up for those and that we'll see you on future webinars. We do record our webinars. This webinar is being recorded. We post the full-length webinars to our YouTube channel. We'll have a link to that YouTube channel in that email as well. The YouTube channel also has a number of shorter videos that, again, run the full spectrum of U.S. immigration law. We will also be sending you a copy of the PowerPoint that you see on your screen, so no need to take a ton of notes. If you do have a question during the presentation, you can use either the chat function on Zoom or the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring questions. I'll probably save questions for the end, but don't hesitate to send those in either way. I plan to get through all of them by the end of the presentation. All right. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in and talk about the TN visa requirements. So as I mentioned before, the TN visa is a wonderful option for people who have a job offer in the United States and they have a passport from either Canada or Mexico. So the first requirement is that you must be a citizen of Canada or Mexico. That means you need a passport from Canada or Mexico. You don't need to have been born there. So as an example, if someone was born in India and became a citizen of Canada and now has a Canadian passport, you would meet this requirement for the TN visa. Next, you need to be coming to the U.S. to work in a certain profession. Now, these professions are listed in the TN regulations, and I'll be referencing the TN regulations throughout this presentation. So if you're at your computer, go ahead and Google NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, TN regulations, and we'll click that link to the regulations. And you see that if you scroll down, there are a number of occupations. There are dozens of occupations, professions, starting with accountants, and then architects, computer systems analysts. These include lawyers. These include management consultants, dentists, astronomers, veterinarians, zoologists. You have really dozens of professions. But you do need to be coming to the U.S. to work in one of these listed professions, which is our second requirement. Now, this is related to the next requirement that you see on your screen, which is that you need to have the required qualifications to practice that profession. And when I say you need the required when I say you need the required qualifications, I'm not referring to what the U.S. employer wants you to have. They might want you to have 30 years of experience That's not what I'm referring to. When I say the qualifications, it is the TN regulations qualifications. So let's take an example. If you look at economist in the regulations, to qualify, you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. And again, this is listed right in the regulations. So the only way you can qualify as an economist is with a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. If we look at accountant, you can qualify based on having a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or a professional license. A lawyer, you can qualify with a a law degree, LLB, JD, or licenciatura degree, 5 years, or membership in a state or provincial bar. So, and let's take one more because we'll talk about it more later. Management consultant. Management consultant, you can qualify based on a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, or equivalent professional experience as established by 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So management consultants can qualify based on a degree or 5 years of experience. So you see that step one is making sure that the profession you're coming to the U.S. to fill is listed in the regulations, and second of all, that you meet the qualifications for that specific profession as they're listed in the regulations. Now, the next requirement you see on your screen, you must have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the U.S. So this is the TN visa is not a visa to use if you want to come to the U.S. to look for a job. You actually do need a job offer in hand, and part of the TN application is actually to have a letter from that employer that talks about how long they intend to employ you, up to 3 years maximum. What your job duties are going to be, how you qualify, why they need someone in that role, how much they're going to pay you, etc. So you do actually need that job offer in hand in order to apply for a TN visa. And next, in that job, you need to employed to engage in professional activities consistent with the listed profession. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if you are coming to the U.S., let's say, as an economist, you have a bachelor's degree in economics, you have a job from a U.S. Company wanting to hire you with the job title of economist, but your job duties are to run their social media campaigns. That's going to be a problem because the government does not think that running social media campaigns is what economists do. How do I know that? What you want to look at is something called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. It's published by the U.S. Department of Labor. We call it the OOH for short. So if you Google OOH, and let's just Google economist, click that link for the Bureau of Labor Statistics Economists Occupational Outlook Handbook, and you'll see a tab at the top that says what they do. If we click that, then we see a list of job duties. These job duties are what the U.S. government thinks that economists do. So if you're telling the government you're coming to the U.S. to work as an economist, you need to actually be performing these job duties. And so those include research economic issues, conduct surveys, collect data, analyze that data using mathematical models, statistical tools, and other software, interpret and forecast trends, advise businesses, governments, and individuals on problems related to fiscal policy or other economic topics, present your research, things like that. So this is just, these are examples. Of course, you don't want to copy and paste these job duties into your TN application, but you do want to make sure that your job duties in the U.S. are aligned with what the U.S. government thinks people do in that profession. And you can Google OOH dentists, OOH management consultants, and you'll see what job duties the government thinks that a given profession does. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. The last item you see on your screen is that the degree must match the job description. What is this referring to? If you are qualifying for a TN visa based on having a diploma or a degree, so before I said economists must qualify based on their degree. There's no other option. You cannot qualify based on experience. You need a degree. So if you're applying to be a TN economist, but and you have a degree, but your degree is in French, that is going to be an issue because the government wants to see that your degree is clearly related to the profession you're coming to the U.S. to practice. So let's continue with that example. If you are coming as an economist and your degree is in economics, you are fine. You're not going to have an issue with that degree because on the face of it, you have a degree in economics. But what if your degree is in, say, accounting? What if your degree is in math or statistics? It's not in economics, but it's in a related degree. This can be okay, but you do want to make sure to show the government that you completed coursework that prepares you to practice the profession. So, for example, if your degree is in math, but you did take a number of economics courses, then you would include a copy of your transcript, and you would actually go through your transcript and list the economics courses you took that qualify you to practice as an economist. You could also take other steps. You could get a letter from your university, from someone in the department who says that the coursework you did prepares you to be an economist. Maybe you did a thesis on a topic related to economics. Maybe you did independent research in economics as part of your math degree. You want to think about what evidence you can gather to show the government that even though your degree is in a related field, you actually did complete the coursework to prepare yourself to practice the profession. The other thing that's really helpful to do is to look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook, because there is a tab called How to Become One. We were looking at the tab What They Do. Let's look at the tab How to Become One. If we click on that, then we see under Education, let's see. So there is language here under Education. Candidates who have a bachelor's degree with sufficient course credits in economics, statistics, or mathematics may qualify for some entry-level economist positions. That is really helpful language if you have a related degree. If your degree is in math, then you want to quote this language that from the government that says that if you have a bachelor's degree with sufficient course credits in economics, statistics, or math, you may qualify for some entry-level economist positions. That's really helpful language for you. So look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook as well if you have a related degree. But what if your degree is in French? You're going to likely have a hard time qualifying for a role as an economist with a degree in French, because a degree in French is not clearly related to economics. But you can still do some of the things we talked about before to make the best case you can. You can, if you took economics classes as part of your degree, if you did research related to economics, if you can get a letter from your department chair or someone at your university talking about how even though you have a French degree, your coursework or independent research or your thesis prepared you for a career in economics, that can be very helpful. So don't be the one to say, no, I don't have a chance because of my degree. It's worth talking with a lawyer. It's worth seeing if you can get some of these pieces of evidence that I talked about before to see if you might actually have a chance, even if your degree is not related. So this is just a screenshot of the Occupational Outlook Handbook. I was using this tab here, What They Do, to find the job duties. This tab here, How to Become One, to look at the related degrees and to see if the OOH talks about that. So what is sponsorship? The reason we have this slide is one of the most common questions we get from people interested in a TN visa is whether the U.S. employer needs to sponsor them. What does sponsorship mean? Why would this question come up? In U.S. immigration law, there are a number of green cards, employment-based green cards, or even temporary visas like the H-1B, where the U.S. employer does need to sponsor the employee. And what sponsorship means in the context of U.S. immigration is that the employer needs to, for example, pay a prevailing wage, which is generally higher than a minimum wage. The employer needs to test the labor market in the U.S. and see if there's a U.S. worker willing and able to fill the position. They need to pay sometimes for the employee's transportation back home if the job is terminated. Sponsorship carries with it a number of requirements. None of those requirements applies to the TN visa. And it's for that reason that we say that TN visas do not require sponsorship. What TN visas do require of the U.S. employer is a legitimate job offer. And the U.S. employer does need to sign a letter that explains the job duties, the expected pay, the expected period of employment. However, that letter is not binding. If the employee shows up and they're just not doing a good job, they can be fired. Conversely, if you take that job, don't like the job, it's not what you thought it would be, you can quit. Of course, you would need to leave. You would not be able to remain in the U.S. in TN status if your employment ends, but you have the flexibility and your employer has the flexibility to terminate that job. There is no requirement that the U.S. employer tests the U.S. labor market. There is no requirement that the U.S. employer pay a wage that's higher than minimum wage. So really, there are no requirements of sponsorship that are part of the TN visa. Now, a few little details on this. If you are filing for a TN visa at a port of entry or at a consulate, then you, as the employee, are filing the application. If you are approved, you as the employee are approved for a TN visa. If you're denied, that denial is on your record as the employee. In contrast, if you're applying within the U.S., then you would be applying through USCIS, and it would be the employer that's filing that application. The employer would sign the form I-129, which is the form that's required for a TN. And if that application within the U.S. is denied, it would be the employer's denial on that. It would not be the employee's denial. That does not change the obligations on the employer. So just filing in the U.S. and the employer submitting the application does not create a sponsorship relationship, does not create those additional responsibilities I talked about before that are required in sponsorship but not required for a TN. It's just that if the application is submitted within the U.S., the employer is technically the one that signs those forms and submits them. Whereas if the applicant is applying at a port of entry or at a consulate, it is the applicant that's filing that application. So I've hinted at this, at what's on this slide, which is that the application process is different for Canadians and Mexicans. For Canadians, they have the option of applying for the TN visa at a port of entry, whether that's an airport, whether that's a land crossing. Nationals of Canada can approach the port of entry, the officer or the border officer, with their TN application. And if they are approved, they will get a decision immediately. They will be allowed entry into the U.S. And as soon as they're allowed entry, they can start working for the TN employer. Extremely convenient, extremely fast, relatively inexpensive. So this is a wonderful option for nationals of Canada. Most of our clients who are nationals of Canada are going to apply for a TN visa that way, through a port of entry. Nationals of Canada, if they're approved, they will get a TN visa up to 3 years, so they can leave and re-enter multiple entries and exits over a 3-year period. Now, one of the caveats to this is only nationals of Canada can get TN status at a port of entry or, for example, an airport or a land crossing. If their spouse or if their child has a passport that is not from Canada, meaning they don't have Canadian citizenship, then that spouse or child must apply at a consulate if they're outside the U.S. And it's for that reason that Canadians might apply at a consulate. If their dependent can't apply at a port of entry, then sometimes it's easier for them all to just apply at the consulate. Dependents, meaning spouses or children, would get a TD visa, not a TN visa, a TD visa. And a TD visa does give them the ability to study in the U.S., does not give them the ability to work in the U.S., and that's very important. If the spouse or the child is a national of Canada, they can apply at a port of entry along with the principal if the principal is a national of Canada, has a Canadian passport. Nationals of Mexico, if they're outside the U.S., must go to a consulate. They cannot apply through a port of entry, whether that's an airport or a land crossing. So nationals of Mexico must apply at a consulate if they're outside the U.S. They would, if they're approved, they do have the option of getting a 4-year TN visa. They would have to pay an additional amount for that 4-year visa, but it is usually worthwhile because that means you don't have to go to the consulate more often. Now, for both nationals of Mexico and Canada, that validity period, I mentioned 3 years for Canadians, 4 years for nationals of Mexico, that can be shortened and would be shortened if, for example, the U.S. employer says we only need this person for a year. If the employer letter says we only need this person for a year, you're only going to be granted a maximum of a year. You're not going to get 3 or 4 years. However, most TN applications do ask for the maximum period of time. So that would be approved for 3 years or 4 years in the case of a Mexican national. For nationals of Mexico, they, in certain cases, can renew their TN visas by mail. This is something that the consulate would let them know if they're eligible for. They would file their application with the consulate, and then the consulate would say, you don't need to come in for an interview, you can mail in your passport. You do need to physically be in Mexico when you mail your passport to the consulate, but it can still save you a trip to the consulate itself for an interview. We'll go into more details on exactly what the application process looks like for nationals of Canada and Mexico. So let's talk a little bit about a couple particularly challenging TN visa professions. I mentioned before that there are literally dozens of professions listed in the TN regulations, and that you need to be coming to the U.S. to work in one of those listed professions, whether that's accountant, economist, management consultant, dentist. Again, there are dozens of professions. 2 of those professions are particularly challenging, and they're challenging for different reasons. The first is management consultants. If you remember, I mentioned before that you can qualify as a management consultant, a TN management consultant, based on experience alone. This is one of the few professions, TN professions, that does not require a degree. Almost every other TN profession either requires a degree, a bachelor's degree, or a licenciatura degree, or it requires a professional license that itself will usually require a degree. So for people who don't have a degree, they are oftentimes going to just apply as a management consultant, even if they don't plan to be a management consultant in the U.S. And the government knows that. And as a result, the government will heavily scrutinize management consultant applications. Now, I want to be clear that not all management consultant applications are risky. Cases that are not necessarily risky are those where someone is coming to the U.S. to work for a management consulting firm. So let's say you work for McKinsey in Mexico City, and you're applying to work for McKinsey in New York City. That is a straightforward application. You would simply need to show that you either have 5 years of experience or you have a bachelor's degree in a related field, and that you are going to fill a management consultant role. That is not risky. What is risky is when the U.S. employer is not a management consulting company. The example I like to use is, let's imagine that there is a company in the US that manufactures solar panels. And they are struggling with reducing costs and improving efficiency in the way that they manufacture solar panels. So they want to hire someone who is an expert in solar panels in Mexico. And that person who's an expert in solar panels is going to come to the US and act as a consultant for this US solar panel company. That is a risky case. And the reason that is risky, meaning challenging, is that the US company is not a management consulting company. It is a solar panel company. That being said, that application can certainly be approved. It just needs to be structured in a certain way. The overarching idea that you need to keep in mind if you're trying to get a management consulting TN visa to work for a company in the US that's not a management consulting firm is that the job in the US needs to be what's called supernumerary. What that means is it's not a permanent role at the US company. In other words, in our example, our TN applicant could not come to the US to fill a permanent role at the solar panel company. Let's say that that solar panel company used to have a full-time employee who was, say, solar panel engineer or solar panel, efficiency expert. It was a W-2 full-time position, 40 hours a week. That is probably going to be denied because the government's going to look at that and say, this does not look like a management consulting role. It looks like a permanent position. A management consulting role usually, let's take our solar panel company. What it would usually do is hire a management consulting company, whether that's McKinsey, BCG, Bain, etc. They would hire that management consulting company to send a management consultant or a team of management consultants to their company to advise them on the challenge they're facing. They would complete that work, provide their recommendations, and then they would leave. They would not be permanent employees of the solar panel company. They would be contracted consultants. And that is exactly the way that a TN application for a management consultant needs to look if the U.S. employer is not a management consulting firm. You want to, in these applications, you want to clearly define what the problem is that the U.S. company is facing, that where they need a management consultant. So in our example, it would be the solar panel company facing increased costs, decreased efficiencies in the manufacturing of solar panels. You'd want to explain why the applicant, the TN applicant, is the best person to address that challenge, maybe based on their experience, their background, etc. That's different from qualifying for the TN visa. So they do to qualify under the TN regulations, they would need to show they either have that degree or 5 years of experience. And that's to qualify for the TN visa. But in addition to that, you should explain why this person will actually be able to help you with the challenge you're facing. That's why you need them as a management consultant. Okay. Typically, also, you would have a consulting agreement. This would detail what the deliverables are, where the person is coming to the U.S. They're going to observe what's going on at the company for, say, a month. They're going to provide recommendations for a month. They're going to meet with management for a month. They're going to monitor the application of their recommendations. And they're going to be compensated based on these deliverables. That's oftentimes what a consulting agreement will look like. And also how they're going to be compensated. And usually that is as a 1099 contractor rather than as a W-2 employee. So you start to see how really the TN application needs to make it clear that this really is a legitimate management consulting engagement. This is not us as the U.S. company trying to hire a permanent employee, even for a 3-year period. This really is us needing to take on a management consultant to address a challenge we're facing. And one last point is oftentimes these management consultant applications are fewer than 3 years because 3 years is a quite long engagement for a management consultant to come in and advise a company how to address its challenges. So usually these will be a year, maybe 2 years tops. If you do go for 3 years, it's just a riskier application. It's just going to face more scrutiny, likely, and a higher chance of being denied. So do keep that in mind. The economist profession is also challenging for very different reasons. The reason this category is challenging is that the government in 2017 issued a memo that basically narrowed what the government thinks economists do, the job duties they have. And this memo made it clear that economists do not work as financial analysts or market research analysts. Financial analysts are really employed by institutions or banks to maximize profits in general. They're looking for ways to invest money and generate profits. Market research analysts are analyzing opportunities to market the goods or services that a company is producing or providing. So in TN economist applications, what you want to do is spend a good amount of time on the Occupational Outlook Handbook that I mentioned before. You want to go to that economist page. You want to look at the job duties that the government thinks economists do, and you want to make sure that the vast majority of your time is going to be spent doing those job duties. So if we go back to the economist page on the Occupational Outlook Handbook, what they do, you want to make sure you're researching economic issues, conducting surveys, collecting data, analyzing that data, interpreting and forecasting trends, advising businesses, governments, individuals on problems related to fiscal policy or other economic topics, presenting your research in tables, graphs, articles, etc. You do want to make sure that your job duties are aligned with those if you're applying as a TN economist. At the same time, you should go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook's page for financial analysts and market research analysts, see what those job duties are and make sure you're not going to be spending a lot of time doing those job duties. Because if you are, the government is likely to say, well, it looks like you're actually going to be working as a financial analyst or as a market research analyst, and you can't do that in the economist category. These two categories really do benefit from legal assistance. These are, in general, the more complicated TN applications. So if you have any questions, I would recommend that you schedule a consultation. It really can be worthwhile, particularly in these two categories. So let's talk a little bit more about what the application process for a TN visa looks like. I mentioned before that Canadians can apply at a port of entry, whereas nationals of Mexico cannot. So what Canadians would do if they are going to apply at a port of entry is really bring their packet, their application packet with them to that port of entry, whether that's an airport or a land crossing. The application packet, which is generally going to be the same whether you're applying at a port of entry, a consulate, or USCIS, that application packet is going to include a letter from the U.S. employer that talks about who the U.S. employer is, why they need someone in this role, who the applicant is, how they qualify for the TN visa. Also, details about the employment opportunity, what the salary is expected to be, what the job duties are going to be, and make sure that those job duties are aligned with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says people in that profession do. Also, what period of time? Oftentimes, applications will be for the maximum 3 years or 4 years of time, but not necessarily. If you actually need one, if the U.S. employer needs someone for a shorter period, the letter would explain that. So that employer letter is going to really frame the application and how the applicant qualifies. The next piece of information, documentation you need in the application is proof that you qualify for the TN. So if you're applying as an economist, you can only qualify based on your degree, so you would actually bring your original diploma with you to the interview. If you are applying as a management consultant based on experience, you would need original signed letters from past employers talking about how you worked for them for at least 5 years, meeting that experience requirement. If you're qualifying based on a professional license, you need to have that certified copy or original license with you when you apply for the TN. And of course, you also need to bring your passport with you. But the application packet is generally quite short. It's just that letter and proof of how you qualify. So oftentimes it's fewer than 20 pages or so, the entire application. Um, some ports of entry, so for Canadians who can apply at ports of entry, some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. And if you're a first-time TN applicant, it's oftentimes a good idea to go to one of these designated ports of entry. So do check the CBP website to find out which ports of entry are included. Do try to go to one of those. It can make the process more streamlined. It's also a good idea to call ahead of time the port of entry just to make sure you know when that they're operating, that they're accepting TN applications, if there are any certain hours that they recommend you apply, etc. So let's switch to nationals of Mexico who must, if they're outside the U.S., must apply at a U.S. consulate. To apply at a consulate, they would first file a Form DS-160, which is a form submitted online. They would pay the visa application fee. They'd schedule their fingerprints, called their biometrics, and they would go to the TN interview when the consulate invites them in. They would be asked questions about the role, about what their job duties will be, how they found the opportunity, etc. And then if they're approved, they would get the visa in their passport within typically a few days of their interview. And then once they have the visa, they'll be able to enter the U.S. in TN status. Again, as I mentioned, if they're applying to renew their visa, sometimes the consulate will allow them to apply by mail, but the consulate will let them know that. I'll just quickly say that the interview at a consulate, the questions are usually similar to those asked at a port of entry. So if you're a Canadian applying at a port of entry, you'll probably be asked about what your job duties will be, how you found the employer, what the employer does, etc. It's usually a quite fast interview, whether at the consulate or at a customs and at a port of entry. The final option is to apply within the United States through USCIS. So this process is slightly different in a few ways. So as I mentioned before, it's the employer that files the application with USCIS. They would file a Form I-129, which is signed by the employer. They would also include the same supporting documents as I mentioned before, the letter from the employer, proof of how the applicant qualifies, whether that's a copy of their degree, transcript, experience letters, etc. With USCIS, though, they will only accept copies, so you don't want to send originals to them. USCIS does take longer than than the port of entry, certainly. Right now, USCIS I-129s, I believe, are taking several months. But you do have the option of paying for premium processing. That's about $3,000, and it does guarantee you a decision within 15 business days. So, if you don't want to leave the U.S. and you want a decision as fast as possible, that premium processing is going to be your best bet. Consulates, the timing really depends on the consulate itself. Each consulate has its own time frame. So usually between a month to 3 months is about standard for consulates. And then, of course, for a port of entry, it's instant and also relatively cheap. So that is a wonderful option for those Canadian nationals who can apply at a port of entry. So some tips and common pitfalls. I mentioned before it's usually a good idea to call ahead to the port of entry just to make sure you understand if they have any unique procedures, whether they're open at certain hours or if they want you to use a certain entrance, things like that. Also, let the person who signed your employer letter, let them know when you plan to apply, whether that's when your consular interview is or when you plan to go to the port of entry. And the reason is that sometimes border officers or consular officers will actually call the U.S. employer just to make sure that the job offer is legitimate. It's usually a quick call, but it is good if the employer picks up the phone. So just give them a heads up just in case. This isn't common, but it does sometimes happen. Next, make sure that if you're applying at a port of entry or at a consulate, you have originals. So original signatures, originals of your diploma, or certified copies of your transcripts. The ports of entry and consulates see a lot of fraud. So they are not happy when they get copies, and you don't want to put all this time in just to be denied because you didn't bring the original. So take the time to get the originals or certified copies before you go. Finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa, meaning it's a temporary visa. It's not a green card. It does not lead to a green card, so you do need to show that you plan to leave the U.S. at the end of your visa or your status. Now, you can renew your TN visa as many times as you want as long as you remain eligible. So meaning you continue to perform the job duties aligned with the TN regulations, your employer remains eligible as long as they're in existence. That's probably not going to be a problem. But as long as you remain eligible for the TN, you can renew it indefinitely. There's no limit on that. As long as you are in the first, say, 5 years or so of your TN, you're probably not going to get questions about your intent to leave. You can start getting questions, say, the second time or third time you renew your TN. So it can be a good idea just to bring proof that you have ties to Canada or Mexico, whether that's your bank statements from accounts you have there, if you own property there, proof that you own property, things like that. But again, you're usually not going to be asked about this until you're on your second or third TN. Now, it's not impossible to move from a TN to a green card. It's just that your intent when you enter on a TN cannot be to pursue the green card. That is a very complex area of immigration law, so if you have questions about that, do reach out for a consultation. All right. If you do have any last minute questions, feel free to send them in. Otherwise, I do appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Keep an eye out for the email we'll send after this presentation with a copy of our presentation, our PowerPoint, our YouTube channel, a link to our YouTube channel where we have a recording of this webinar and many others, as well as our blog where we have hundreds, if not thousands, of articles. And if you have any questions, do schedule a consultation. We'd be very happy to help you. In the meantime, stay well. Thank you so much.